I'm going to primarily talk about ChatGPT. I could have really brought in any number of examples, Bitcoin, for example, or blockchain, but I wanted to focus on ChatGPT. And interestingly, it's been in the news, if anyone has been following, which I will try to touch on a little bit because it relates a bit about what I want to say. So, first thing is I wanted to draw your attention to this new book that I co-edited. It just came out in September, and it's open access, so you can get it for free. And it has 35 introductory chapters that touch on many of the things I will cover in this talk. And so if you want to learn more about ecomedia studies, this book is designed to be a very good introduction to it. So briefly, what I want to say is that ecomedia studies, which is an emerging field, as a starting point, has a revised and expanded definition of media, which is to think of media as not just about the environment. It's not just representations, but it comes from the environment. It's part of the environment, is comprised of the environment, and changes the environment. And that ecomedia studies are ecomedia studied through iterative circuits consisting of diverse critical areas of scholarship. So it really touches on many different fields. So one of the goals is to change our thinking or to sort of provoke our thoughts about the way we imagine media, because historically it's always been thought of as a very clean technology, something very futuristic and progressive. But the reality is far dirtier. So a lot of what I have to say is to kind of focus on reorienting our understanding of what we mean by media. So Ecomedia Literacy has been a project I've been working on ever since I did my PhD work, which is to try to find a way to integrate media literacy with these ideas that are emerging in ecomedia studies. Because I found when I got into when I got into media literacy over 20 years ago, actually 25 years ago at this point, there really was very little about the environment. So this has sort of been my life project. So ecomedia literacy combines systems thinking, ecomedia studies, ecojustice, and critical media literacy to analyze the ecological impacts of media. And I want to just stress how important this concept of eco or climate justice is, which is really at the core of my outlook and also my co-editors on the new book. And just to throw out a definition, which is that environmental climate struggles are intersectional with social justice. That is intersectional, not intersectional. This is not a gender talk. Intersectional with class, race, gender, ableism, inequality, globalization, etc. So if we were to ask Alexa, what is your environmental impacts? Speaking of gender, I don't know if I should identify Alexa as a male or female or it's, but it would probably not give us a very clear answer, because if we want to think about what are media and what is at the backbone of something, a technology like Alexa, we have to start rethinking about media as infrastructure. This is one of the main aims of ecomedia studies, is to get beyond the concept of media as simply screen media, but to think of it as an infrastructure. These various different images are descriptions of the ways that our media are quite literally wired all over the globe, whether it's through undersea cables or satellites or cables laid out in the physical ground of various locations across the world. And also that data centers, which is the photo on the lower right, is an example of a data center, have a massive footprint. They take up space, and they use a lot of water and energy, and in certain ways also impact biodiversity, because they are because of their physical footprint. So in my framing of ecomedia, I talk about first ecomedia footprint, which just very briefly, starting with the left side, it deals with exploring conflict minerals and the actual raw resources that are used in all of our gadgets and devices. Also looking at labor practices, such as in China mostly, where a lot of our gadgets are made, issues of e-waste, electromagnetic frequencies, and electromagnetic pollution. And last but not least, the fossil fuels needed to power the cloud that serves all of our data. And then the ecological or ecomedia mind print, which is the various different ways that media, this is more of the realm of traditional media studies, but the way that media influence or impact our understanding of the environment, whether it's news discourses, advertising, popular culture, disinformation, but also some of the positive ways that media educate and inform us about the environment, but also help coordinate the way that so people can take action and so forth. So in terms of incorporating the eco-justice frame, one of the sort of guiding frameworks that I'm using is this concept of the 5 E's. I'm not going to spend any time defining these because you could reference them in the book, but I just want to give you the overview, which is enclosure, which is enclosing the commons and the ways of knowing the world. So I want to stress also, quite often I'm talking about both the way that these impact physical, material realities, but also the realms of ideas and thoughts. For example, when we say enclosing the commons, we can talk about enclosing ecological commons, that is water systems or forests or things like that, but also ways of knowing the world, enclosing knowledge, and privatizing information, extraction of resources, energy, data, and attention, expendability of ecosystems and sacrifice zones and disposable peoples, the exploitation of labor and land, and then the externalization of these destructions costs to peoples and the environments. And these various photos on the right are just little snapshots of different examples of these, whether it's workers in China, India, or other parts of the world in Africa, also processing e-waste, or massive mining projects for copper or tin, or various different metals that we use, or lithium and rare earth minerals in the Congo, like lithium or cobalt, and then also oil. We have to remember that all of this requires oil, whether it's for plastic or also powering our devices. So turning to algorithms, there's a lot of things going on in the world's trends that are really pushing environmental impacts of our media technologies. And they're almost entirely algorithm driven, whether it's AI, facial voice recognition, cryptocurrency, blockchain, NFTs, frictionless online shopping, VR, online gaming, ad tech, music and video streaming, and online work and meetings. So I'm going to focus primarily on AI for this talk, but we could really look at any one of these using the methodology I want to share with you. So one of the frameworks that I start with, which I feel is very important, is this concept of environmental ideology. So it's important when we talk about environmental ideology that we don't think of environmental in a normalizing way, that when we say environmental, it doesn't mean automatically something is good. It's just an attitude towards the environment. And we have a range of environmental ideologies that are operating in the world simultaneously, from anthropocentric to ecocentric. So I like Aaron Stibe's definition of environmental ideology, which is a story about how the world was, is, and should be in the minds of members of a group. So it's important to recognize and identify environmental ideology because it underlies everything that we do. And, there are sort of 3 levels to this, which is our environmental ideology determines what we value, and then what we value then leads to the rights that we assign to that, and then that has certain consequences. So what I've shown you is sort of two extremes, the extreme anthropocentric and the extreme ecocentric, and there's also many in the middle here. So I don't want to say that there's only two positions here. It's not black or white. There's many shades of variation. But on the extreme anthropocentric side, if we treat the environment or nature as instrumental, then the kind of rights that we assign to the environment would be private property. It's something that we own, that we commoditize. But the consequences of that, here I'm giving you examples of the negative consequences, would be eco-apartheid or ecocide. And then the emphasis on a critical infrastructure, which is an infrastructure of greed or destruction for fossil fuels and resources like that. Whereas if you were going to take the ecocentric perspective, then we would see the environment as having intrinsic value, at which point we would assign rights of nature, land rights, animal rights, etc., which would create a different type of infrastructure, one that a lot of indigenous groups argue for, which is an infrastructure of relations based on caretaking, balance, intergenerational justice, being a good relative, and reciprocity. So the types of, I've developed two methods of analysis. There could be more. These are the primary ones that I work with. One is the iceberg model of systems thinking. I did not invent that. I am sort of incorporating this approach, which comes from people who do systems analysis. And then on the right side is the ecomedia sphere, which is the one I'm going to focus on today. So the ecomedia sphere is inspired by the circuit of culture, which comes out of cultural studies, which is this idea that anytime you do some kind of analysis, you approach it from different analytical perspectives. So in terms of grading this approach, I use these four lenses or four zones: ecoculture, political ecology, ecomateriality, and life world. And then any ecomedia object can be analyzed using these four different zones. And so I have many different examples on this slide. It could be an advertisement. So it could be any kind of media text, a film, an ad, a TV show, a newspaper article. It could be a gadget. It could be a platform, or it could be a hypermedia object, which is something you can't touch. So disinformation, for example, is something that I've worked with Julian on before, and it's something that interests me quite a bit. I'm not going to talk too much about it today, but what I want to focus on is primarily ChatGPT as a case study. So when I set out to do this analysis, I mostly started this last March, but I did a double check and found that pretty much all the responses have stabilized. I'm not using, this was ChatGPT 3. They're up to 3.5, which is the free version. I have not subscribed to 4, so I have not tried this with 4. So I'm going to talk about each zone here in relation to ChatGPT. So first, I want to start with ecoculture, and I want to define that. So ecoculture is meaning, values, lifestyles, identity formations, or ways of knowing, and rituals and practices mediated through shared interpretations and sense-making practices. So I thought I'd be cheeky and just ask ChatGPT, what is your impact on ecoculture? And it's clear that it was faking it. ChatGPT didn't know what I was talking about. So it kind of made up a response that it thought I was looking for. So the first line, as I highlighted here, is that ChatGPT itself does not have a direct impact on ecoculture. And then you go down to the second paragraph. ChatGPT can help raise awareness about environmental issues and promote eco-friendly practices. So I think that's what it was thinking that I wanted. And then it closed with this, I thought kind of actually an interesting reflection, if that's the right word, because I don't think it actually reflects. But ChatGPT's ability to communicate with people from all over the world in different languages can help promote cross-cultural understanding and collaboration on environmental issues. By facilitating dialogue and knowledge sharing, ChatGPT can contribute to more global and interconnected approaches to addressing environmental challenges, which is actually a nice phrase. But the question then arises, what kind of knowledge is being shared? That's, I think, really the key question. So along with analyzing some of the textual responses of ChatGPT, if you're doing this methodology, you also want to look at the visual representations and the kind of narratives that are being promoted around the particular topic. So I did a bit of a deep dive of OpenAI's website. OpenAI is the company that is the creator of ChatGPT. And I'll talk a bit about the images, but if we were in class, I would ask you, what do you notice about these images? And we can have a discussion about that. But we can, at the very end, have a bit of a Q&A. But I want to sort of move through this analysis first. I think the three key words that I noticed over and over again throughout the OpenAI website was the words participation, safety, and inclusion. These are sort of like, I would say, the key words that drive the way that they represent themselves. Also, they tend to emphasize that it's a tool that you use, but then I put in parentheses, by implication, it doesn't use you. They're not saying that, but I think that's the implication. And then their reference to GPT-4, which is the paid version, is that it's creative and it's collaborative. So the logo, which is interesting, I did a little research about what the logo represents. So it's geometric, but it's also in the shape of a flower. It has these very soft edges. The chain links are supposed to represent interconnectedness, and the swirl vortex is meant to represent eternal life and infinity. And then also the color is very sort of natural feeling color, something green, that feels good for maybe to invoke a sense of the environment. And then the video, there's a video that goes on the website that I thought was kind of interesting. It had this very soft music and soft colors, lots of plants, relaxed atmosphere, informal, didn't seem very businesslike, very natural. I kept feeling like natural, like the wood looks natural, the materials look natural, even the clothes that everyone's wearing looks like, that cotton, organic cotton. And there's a very light technology touch. The technology is barely present. People have a few laptops or phones, but you don't really get a sense of the massive server farms that are driving ChatGPT or any of that. It's absent. It's in an urban environment. It seems to be fairly young, cosmopolitan, multicultural, and female. I felt that I noticed that the majority of the people represented were female. So the kind of words that I kind of highlighted throughout the website on its various different pages are phrases that I think are kind of key, are like useful for the world, better quality of life, useful for everyone, make thoughts and ideas flourish. Not perfect, but it makes mistakes, amplifies what every person is able to do, brings learning to everyone, helps us be more productive, which leads to a better quality of life. We care that it is useful for everyone, as many people participate as possible, to learn, to make it suitable for society. They very much want to promote themselves as aligning themselves with society. Now, I put a question here. I'm not going to answer it, but an Ecomedia question is, who is this for and who does the we and the us refer to here? Because I think very much the voice they're speaking in is the royal we, meaning we in the rich industrialized northern democratic countries. And I don't think they necessarily represent the people who work in the various different sites of extraction or e-waste sites. So my observation, my sort of hot take analysis of these different phrases is that what you see here from an eco-cultural perspective is a reproduction of modernist ideology, which is that knowledge is contextless, timeless, placeless, universal, general, and abstract. None of the knowledge or information that you get from ChatGPT is localized in a place. It doesn't come from a particular culture. It's very generalized. Also, there's quite clearly a case of enclosure, which is that they're scraping the internet and copyrighted material to produce the knowledge base. They're not transparent about that, so we don't know, what data sets they have scraped. But this is a practice of enclosing the commons, taking what is common knowledge and privatizing it for profit. It promotes the concept of progress as inevitable and good. And then I just throw these last questions in because these questions are implied, which is, are we good enough? Do we need improvement? Do we need more efficiency? Do we need more productivity? And then what are we being productive for? And then I ask this last question, do we really need this? And if we do need it, why do we need this? So just last few points about this part of the analysis. It draws from data sets, but what is the nature of the data sets? We don't know. It is indifferent to truth. This is one of the biggest critiques of algorithms, but in particular, these large language models. They're not committed to truth. That's not the point of them. And then some of the critics have also pointed out that these data sets likely, because we don't know what they are exactly, but they tend to not include voices of women, older people, and marginalized groups, and they lead to inevitable biases that affect the decisions of systems that are built on top of them. And then in the environmental movement, we have this idea of the precautionary principle, which is, I'll just borrow a phrase from the anti-nuclear movement. If they say that it's safe, why not bury it there? In other words, if the White House says it's safe, why not bury it at the White House, right? If we don't know if it's safe, we shouldn't do it. So I think that there's a big tension in the AI community. That, not some people want to disrupt, which is to move fast and break things. The other people want to be slow and cautious. I think, from what I'm reading, this is one of the major rifts that resulted in the big turmoil at OpenAI last week, where the founder was fired, but then he was brought back in as the new CEO. And it seems to have been somewhat of a rift between the people that want to be careful and go slow versus the people with a stronger capitalist mindset. Artificial intelligence, chatbot, natural language processing tools embody algorithmic bias, but also the culture and institutional prejudices about ecology that form the knowledge base. And I'll give an example of this in a few minutes. So I would argue that these are primarily machines of ideology. And I want to quote Ruha Benjamin, who, if you haven't read her Race After Technology, I highly recommend it. She argues that algorithmic codes operate within powerful systems of meaning that render some things visible, others invisible, and create a vast array of distortions and dangers. So what is happening with these language models is they're scraping knowledge bases that already have inherent biases within them. Again, we don't know exactly what they're scraping, but we can assume that they're scraping institutional knowledge in English from universities, from sites of knowledge production that tend to have their own sort of status and privilege that we could critique. So moving to the next zone of political ecology, and here I want to define it. The study of how economic and power structures design systems that produce impacts on the environment, including the production of ideologies and material goods. So once again, I just asked, what is the political ecology of ChatGPT? And it was clear that ChatGPT doesn't know what political ecology is. So this goes back to the data sets, like what is it being trained on? So the fact is, it's not being trained on materials that are critical of the political economy of media and in general. So it's data sets, because they don't have this scholarly background, it has to kind of guess and predict what it is that I'm looking for. But it kind of falls back on this word ideology that I used, or political ecology, assume that I was talking about political ideology. So it needed to tell me, and I think this is trained into the system, that it's that its responses are not influenced by political ideology. And I think all of us know that anytime the system says we're not ideological, it usually means that they are ideological. And then it says here, my responses are generated based on statistical patterns in the language data I was trained on. And then on the bottom, I highlight here, my responses may reflect the biases or limitations of the data I was trained on, or in a way that certain topics or issues are discussed in society. So that's a fair conceit. I'm glad it admits that, because that's ultimately what I'm arguing here. Therefore, it is important for users to critically evaluate the information I provide and consider multiple sources of information when making decisions or forming opinions. So ChatGPT is basically telling us to be media literate. So I guess the owners had to like throw that in there to make sure that they didn't get in trouble. So when I asked ChatGPT what are the ecological benefits of AI, it gave me these 5 responses. I won't go into detail, but I'll just highlight the main headlines: conservation, efficient resource management, precision agriculture, climate modeling, and green energy. So these are all technological responses to the environmental crisis. And so this is where I'm going to get into its ideological biases. So I want to return back to this framework of the anthropocentric versus ecocentric. This next slide shows you the spectrum of ideologies that exist, and there could be many more. These are sort of the most common environmental ideologies that we can identify in this spectrum. And so you see at the very top, unrestrained instrumentalism. That's just sort of like outright colonialism and vicious capitalism. And at the very bottom, in the most ecocentric environmental ideology, would be more indigenous or traditional approaches. So you'll notice that in the middle, I have some light green headers here where it says conservation, preservation, and ethics and value-driven approaches. These are essentially what are the positions of mainstream environmentalism. And Julian Corbett, who came up with this particular model, argues that these positions are, in essence, still anthropocentric because they're there to preserve the status quo and to preserve the human domination of the environment. They don't necessarily put humans in the environment as equals in the case of an ecocentric ideological environment ideology. And all those different examples that ChatGPT gives about the environment tend to be within the range of mainstream environmentalism. I could definitely see that I would put them right squarely in either conservationism or preservationism, and maybe ethics and value-driven environmental beliefs. So what that tells me is that the kind of environmental responses, like if you ask ChatGPT, what's the best way to solve climate crisis, it's not going to give you an anti-capitalist response. It will definitely not do that. It will give you something in the sort of middle range of the mainstream environmental movement. And that's probably because the data that it's scraping is institutional knowledge bases. This is the mainstream of global institutional frameworks of the UN and so forth. So I would argue that in terms of the political ecology framework, ChatGPT reproduces neoliberal and dark patterns of structures. Again, it's a machine of ideology because it reproduces taken for granted knowledge about the environment. It's also based on extractive technology because this whole system cannot work with those 5 E's that I was talking about before. And I'll add one more element, which is the story of exploited labor, which is all the cheap labor that they used in primarily Kenya, but other parts of the world, to train the data sets, people earning a couple dollars a day, to actually teach ChatGPT how to code and to identify certain categories of knowledge. I just want to throw one thing in. I asked the same question to Google Bard, and it actually gave me a response that was somewhat surprising and different, which is that it said AI could be used to develop autonomous weapons that could be used to destroy ecosystems. So I absolutely agree with that. And that's a big danger of AI. And I was actually, I don't know if pleased is the right word, but I was glad that Bard said this, because this is certainly not part of sort of the optimistic, sunny kind of rhetoric that you see coming out of ChatGPT. And also, Bard raised the problem of misinformation about the environment, which also did not come up in ChatGPT. And misinformation, disinformation is a big concern of mine. And I'm not really talking about it today, but this is something that I would love to see explored much more when we talk about algorithms and AI. Anyways, just a side note. Moving on to ecomateriality, again, to just define it, what I mean by this term, it's the exploration of the material connections between media and the environment. So this is actually the kind of the, I don't know if fun is the right word, but the funniest response I read when I asked, what is the environmental impact of your answers? ChatGPT said, as an AI language model, I do not have any physical presence or environmental impact. I exist solely as a software program, and I do not consume resources or generate any waste or pollution. And then moving on, it says, I do not have the ability to have an impact on the environment, and my primary function is to provide information and to support users. I recommend consulting with the manufacturer or service provider for more information. I don't want to say that ChatGPT is lying, because it can't lie. It's more like it's bullshitting. It's just, this is not this response is not grounded in reality. It just is not. So I decided to ask further, what is the physical infrastructure that runs you? And here we got, actually, it got a little bit more to the reality of the situation, which is, as an AI language model, I do not have a physical body or infrastructure. I exist solely as a software program and are able to function through the use of computer hardware and software systems. But if you go down, it then acknowledges that this requires a complex network of hardware and software components. But then again, it tells you that if you want to learn more, go to the manufacturer and talk to them. So they're kind of, it wipes its hands clean about its environmental impacts. I would argue that this kind of response is a reflective of the mind-body duality that we have in modernity and Western culture, where the mind has no body. And in a certain way, ChatGPT thinks it has no body as well. So I tried to figure out, well, what is running ChatGPT? And I was able to track down on a Microsoft blog that their Azure AI supercomputers is what runs OpenAI. And I think some of the partnership between Microsoft and OpenAI was an important component of this big turmoil that happened at the company during the week. And from what I understand, there's some exploration about a competing company that might be developing new chips. And that was one of the things that Microsoft feared in terms of the leadership makeup of OpenAI. So I'm not going to get into that too much. But anyhow, just to give you a sense of, these supercomputers. And Microsoft, when you try to figure out what is their environmental impact, they're kind of cagey. They have all this rhetoric about net zero and water zero, but it's really hard to verify any of their claims. I don't really trust them. To summarize, the main environmental impacts of AI, in particular ChatGPT, is energy consumption, because they have to train all these computers. It's very energy intensive. Water usage. These energy centers use a lot of water to cool down these computers. And then electronic waste. All the computers that they're using, these server centers have to get replaced and updated quite often, and they just get tossed and thrown out. Again, if you try to go to OpenAI to try to figure out what are they actually doing about this, there's really not much information. Okay, last zone, and I'll try to wrap this up because I know a lot of people have questions. The life world zone, the portion of the analysis looks at the ecology of perception and sense making and how media affect our sense of place, time, and space. In terms of ChatGPT, what I focus mostly on is how it contributes to an overall epistemic crisis, which is that we have truth without evidence. This is the critique of the dissenting AI folks who call AI a stochastic parrot. And big tech are epistemological because they codify the kinds of information and media content that count as knowledge. And then I have this nice quote here, that algorithms provide a structure that frames and constrains how we express ourselves, and they're a way of seeing and acting in the world. So just for fun, and I'm trying to do this really quickly, I also decided to run some of these terms to DALL-E. So in March, the first time I ran the term ecomedia through DALL-E, it just produced this kind of weird abstract text with words. I did it again yesterday, and I came up with this kind of creepy office scene. I don't know what that has to do with ecomedia. These computers covered with plastic, kind of bizarre, seems to be hallucinating a bit. But I will note that what I find interesting is by using text as its imagery on the left, it's sort of emphasizing this point that I'm making, that when in the data sets, when it thinks about media, it thinks about media in terms of media text, not about infrastructure, not about technology. And then I asked if artificial intelligence is destroying, or give me representations of artificial intelligence destroying nature. Quite often nature was represented by a tree, and then technology, or artificial intelligence, was represented by robots. These are some more from those prompts. And then I asked about I prompted if advertising destroying the environment, came up with these images, which are kind of interesting. I like the one on the left, actually. And then I did this prompt again yesterday, and it came up. So these were from March, and they're a little bit more concrete. They have actual image photos, but the ones from yesterday were much more abstract. And the one on the right, I have no idea what that is. It's just some bad acid trip. So, and then climate change, again, the way climate change is represented was primarily with text. I did it again yesterday. These images that it came up with were quite strange. The one on the left, I really don't know what to make of that. I won't, for the second time, I think I'll just skip this, but just to point your attention to this very important article. This was written by researchers at Google who got fired after they wrote this paper, which basically they called for ChatGPT, or I'm sorry, for AI researchers to weigh the environmental and financial costs first, and be careful about curating and carefully documenting data sets rather than ingesting everything on the web, and to look at stakeholders, not just the interests of the companies, but what are the stakeholders being across the systems that create AI. And then a quick question, why is there so much alarm about AI, but not so much alarm about the climate? That seems to be problematic. And then to ask again, more question about this, why is AI a solution for climate change? I would say, technical solutions will help, but the thing we have to do is to eliminate fossil fuels. I mean, that's really a political and economic decision. Technology is not going to solve that problem, except in the sense of developing new energy sources. But in any case, what AI is being touted for at Google, many of these companies are partnering with fossil fuel companies to make oil extraction more efficient. So there's a contradiction that I don't think is reconcilable. And AI is not a climate solution by itself. We need system change, cultural change, and energy transformation. And the many points of intervention beyond AI to solve the climate crisis include green tech, green infrastructure, government regulation, digital degrowth, which is less digital perhaps, and the democratization of knowledge. I'm going to skip that because this is a good slide. And by the way, Julian, if you want, I can share the slide with you and your students. Slideshow you can look at later. The Green Web Foundation came up with this really fantastic framework of shifts in thinking, and I just want to highlight this because I think it's so good. So to shift from individual blame and shame to one of analyzing power structures and challenging destructive defaults, moving from carbon tunnel vision to center human rights and operate within planetary boundaries. The shift from technology will save us to fostering an open and diverse internet that divest from big tech. And then shifting from just making technology more efficient to a just transition to fossil-free internet with tech workers involved and centered in that process. And to move from the idea of quick fixes to sustained transformative practice.